Hi, I'm Selena, and today we're talking about the Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes. This will be a non-spoiler review until the end, at which point I will switch over into talking about specific spoilery thoughts that I had while reading this book. And just so we're all on the same page, I did give this book 1 star, and so this is going to be a 1-star review. I'm not happy about it either. Also, just so you know, I don't plan on doing too many 1-star reviews just because I don't plan on reviewing books that I don't really like, except on Goodreads. I do review basically everything on Goodreads, but I don't feel like dedicating too many videos to 1-star books. But this one I did because I planned to do a review before I knew it was a 1-star. I fully intended on liking this book because I love The Hunger Games. So excited for this book. And I'm bitter. And I had already planned to do the review. I'd already been writing down my thoughts, so I'm gonna do it. It's a 1-star. Whoops. So if you don't know, this is the prequel book for the Hunger Games trilogy. Suzanne Collins recently published the prequel to the Hunger Games, which is The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes, and this follows the president in Katniss's time before he was president and as he was a teenager. So in this book, he's a teenager and he does not have the power that he has in the original Hunger Games trilogy. So it's kind of a villain origin story, a corruption arc. We are seeing what made this pretty horrific person into what he is. So the way I structure my spoiler-free reviews is I first go into genre and structure, then plot, then character, then theme, and anything else I need to talk about. In this particular review, that section is going to be dedicated to world building, and then I will have a moment to tie it all together, and then we will get into spoiler-free thoughts. There will be timestamps for all of that in the description if you just want to skip around. So for genre, you all know it's dystopian. Structure-wise, the story is told from the third person with a focus on Coriolanus Snow. The third person point of view isn't a bad thing, it's just different from what we're used to in the Hunger Games. The Hunger Games is a very strong first person point of view with a strong voice of Katniss. But I honestly think that this particular book, the third person, actually makes it weaker in a lot of ways. I honestly think that the third person serves to make Snow more wishy-washy than he already is, and it weakens his voice tremendously. I'm also confused about, based on the structure of this book, who it's for. Other than, I know it's for Hunger Games fans and people who like this first series, but just age range, target age-wise, I'm confused. Hunger Games was originally a YA book that appealed to adults, but it was very much a YA book. It had a lot of traits of YA books, such as themes of kind of coming of age and identity. You have a teen protagonist who sounds like a teen. Reading The Hunger Games in 2020, it is very apparent that this is a YA book, even if it appealed to all ages outside of its target age range. For a Ballad, though, it is not as easy to locate what target age it is going for. Ballad purposely seems like it's trying to be more in the middle, appeal to both YA readers and adult readers. Because if we're being honest, the premise of this book isn't very YA, and Coriolanus is the least relatable protagonist ever for YA readers. The plot is very slow, and the perspective that we follow Coriolanus feels very far away from the reader compared to the closeness that the reader feels with Katniss in the first trilogy. And yet Barnes & Noble is marketing Ballad as their YA book club pick of the month. And so clearly it's being marketed as YA, but it kind of doesn't really feel like YA. So I'm left feeling like this book is confused. It's got traits of both YA and adult. I think it's overwhelmingly got more traits of adult, but it's also got that kind of YA easy writing style. It feels like this book is trying to appeal to so many audiences, and that is creating what it is, instead of just being what it is and appealing to the audience it appeals to. So now let's move on to plot. This is an odd premise for a plot, honestly. If you don't know, the premise of this book is basically that President Snow is going to be serving as a mentor like what Haymitch was, to a tribute from District 12. And that's just weird because why? Why would a capital kid know how to mentor and be expected to mentor a tribute for the Hunger Games? At this point in the book, mentors haven't really developed yet, and that makes sense because it's only the 10th annual Hunger Games, and even if each victor was from a different district, then we wouldn't have enough victors to have a mentor for each tribute. Mentors also, they don't seem to be necessary at all, because a lot of the things that we associate mentors with doing aren't happening in this book. The two canonical jobs we have of mentors, the two main jobs, are to guide tributes in the arena because they've got experience, and to be like a middleman between the victors, the tributes, and the sponsors. At the beginning of this book, there's no sponsorships. When they chose this idea for capital kids to mentor tributes, there was no sponsorship. That wasn't a thing. And then they have no experience in the arena, so they don't know how to help them. And so it's just odd. Like, it's not really a criticism, but like, it's just an odd premise to write a book about. The next thing I want to say about this plot is it's slow. It's boring. It takes like half the book for any action to start. And I know that that is also the case with like the Hunger Games. Like, they don't get into the arena until like halfway through the book. But at least the Hunger Games is like interesting the whole way through, and we're preparing to go into the arena the whole way through. With Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes, there's just nothing happening, because like a lot of the things that we're associated with the Hunger Games, like the interviews and the game makers, all that stuff hasn't developed yet. And so what are we doing? Just wandering around aimlessly for a long time. And then when the action finally does start, we're not right up on it usually, because our perspective is highly limited. We're limited to Snow's perspective, and we're limited to a viewer's perspective of the games once they begin. And this is before the games were such a big spectator sport, and so the cameras and things that we associate with the games that would watch the tributes, like they weren't there. And so there were these places where the tributes would go, and they would just completely leave the book for a bit, and we would not be privy to whatever went on in that maze or whatever. It's like if in Harry Potter 4 we were in Hermione's perspective, while Harry and all the other, like, what are they called? The wizards, all the other wizards involved in the Triwizard Tournament, we watched as they like went under the lake or went into the maze. That is the perspective of this book. It is of a spectator, not someone in the Hunger Games. And because we're not privy to everything that goes on in the Hunger Games, it's not interesting. And like, I know that at this point, it makes sense that the Hunger Games hasn't become like a full-on like mix between like a deadly spectator sport and like a reality TV show sort of thing. Like, it makes sense that that hasn't developed yet. But then my question is, why set a book during this time? Because it makes for a really boring plot. And let's talk about the corruption arc itself. The character plot of this book. It centers on romance, and I'm going to be really vague about this because I don't really want to spoil anything, but it centers on a romance and the failure of said romance in whatever way that might be. And to me, it's honestly just so cringy and cliche, and this trope has been done to death. I'm sick of seeing corruption arcs where this is the reason for some part of our villain psyche. I personally am sick and tired of reading about men who put all of their like morality and personality, all that hinges on some woman in their lives. I just would like a man to take responsibility for once in a book about their own actions and not have it be the fault of some woman, because it doesn't make for a very interesting character to watch either. Not only is it like problematic in gender roles, but like Snow's not interesting because none of what he's doing really comes from him, and we'll get to that with character. In the meantime, this romance is cringy and a plot type, and just it adds nothing new to the trope. It doesn't subvert it in any way. It just takes the trope and basically just does that. Like, there's nothing new to me. It honestly just felt like this book was just going through the motions of what it was supposed to be. And then the climax is just so disappointing. My goodness. It didn't conclude. It just ended. We see the build up to what we think is going to be the climax, and then it just stops. It doesn't have a conclusion. We don't have any catharsis. We don't have any payoff. It doesn't do what it was leading up to. It doesn't lead up to anything. It just stops the lead up. And I honestly think the climax is like that because it's just a condensed reflection of the rest of the book, because we build up to a lot in this book, or we think we do, because there's little hints kind of everywhere to what you think the conclusion is going to be, and it's just not that. I'll get into specifics with this in the spoiler section, but there was just so much stuff that this book seemed to be hinting at or seemed to be wanting to do, and then it did absolutely none of it. It was honestly felt like she left a lot of it to inference, which is fine, but also it's a little bit too open, because if you leave so much of your foreshadowing up to inference, then what have you really accomplished? And that's an unsatisfying arc. It's an unsatisfying end to this plot. Again, I will get into spoilers about what arcs I think didn't close, but I can't get into them right here because, of course, spoilers. But for now, let's move on to character. Let's talk about Snow's character. It's seemingly non-existent for a good portion of this book, so there's that. I personally found Snow kind of pathetic in this book a little bit, just because all of his traits that I remembered him as from mainly Catching Fire is he was a bit performative. He was pretty ruthless. He was very smart. He was in Katniss's head in a lot of ways. He always was reminding her of his own power. He was showboating a lot of the time. All of it was very performative, and he could back it up because he's the president and he runs this terrible society. And so that's what made him interesting and good as a villain in the Hunger Games for me. And all those things I was expecting to see at least develop in this book, like his performativity, kind of, his cunning, his intelligence, his keen intelligence. I was expecting to see it all. And honestly, a lot of it was just put onto another character. I know that he developed some things, like he gets smarter throughout the book, but there were so many times where I was just like, the Snow that I knew would have figured this out already, and he would have already manipulated the situation. Like, he's not even really that manipulative. And it's just odd because I think this book was pitched as Snow's climb to the top, Snow's manipulation to the top, but he doesn't climb his way to the top. He doesn't manipulate to the way to the top. There's a saying in this book that Snow and other Snows really repeat a lot, and it's Snow lands on top. And honestly, Snow in this book really does land on top. He doesn't fight his way there. He doesn't climb his way there. He doesn't manipulate his way there. He really just does the most minimal amount of effort possible, and then other people put him on top. He just kind of lands there. He doesn't really work for it, so it's unsatisfying. He had setbacks, yes, but to me, he didn't take as much initiative as I was expecting from him, because we do see him in a pretty terrible position as the book begins, and I was expecting to see him rise from that in really terrible, nasty ways, but he barely manipulates his own fate at all. Honestly, to me, and I know people will disagree with me about this because there was a whole debate about this, when this book was first announced, that Snow was going to be the protagonist. I don't think Snow should have been the protagonist after reading this book. I was someone who was open to him being the protagonist when I first heard it, but I just don't think there was enough of him to fill a 517-page book. Snow was a good villain. He was a good villain in Catching Fire. He was cunning, and he kind of had this sort of relishing in his own power, but also you could kind of see him slipping a little bit because he really wanted to cut any sort of rebellion down. And so that's what made him a good villain for the Hunger Games. I think he fit theme-wise, I think he fit plot-wise. He was a good villain, but I'm not sure that he's a good main character. I'm not sure there was enough surrounding him that we had to zoom in on him. I don't know that there was enough here to create this book, and that's why we see it being so slow and so little happening and so little character for Snow. There could have been a way to do his character to make it better than it was here, but he's not particularly smart. He's not particularly assertive. He's not really anything special. He's also not particularly twisted, and we don't really see him get there. I don't know. I've seen people debate this and say he is, but I just didn't see it. I was like, where is the villain that we knew? And honestly, if we think about the arc of the series, Snow isn't really in the first book. The villain of the first book, I would say, is more the system itself. And then in Catching Fire, we see the man who's kind of behind the system, the man who props up the system and upholds it and executes it every single day. And he's the villain there. But then he's disposed of pretty quickly in Mockingjay, and so this is the villain that becomes less important through the series arc, not more important. And so I'm not sure why Suzanne Collins thought that there was enough here for this book to exist. And then there's also something about Snow's perspective that makes every person and thing he comes in contact with so boring. Every scene he is in is dragged down. Every single person he comes in contact with in the capital, they're basically all interchangeable to me, and I don't know whether that's because Collins didn't really develop them well. I think it could be a bit of both, but also because Snow had no feelings about them. It's almost like Collins forgot to have him interact with people in a meaningful way. And then the Covey, which are a type of people in this book, the Covey are all basically interchangeable except for one, and she's just a manic pixie dream girl. I know one when I see one. Moving on to theme, this book was a lot closer to the themes of Lord of the Flies than it was the Hunger Games, in my opinion. To me, the Hunger Games was about recognizing humanity and how people are deprived from their humanity, and what happens when you glorify a system that deprives people of their own humanity. And every single thing that happened in the Hunger Games, my gosh, it just added to that theme. It was so beautifully written. And then this one, the themes kind of felt very simplistic. It kind of felt like I'd seen them done before. I'm not a Lord of the Flies fan, and I honestly think the Lord of the Flies executed it better than this book did, because this book is a lot about what we are as humans deep down. And that could have been an interesting theme. It's just that I thought it was just so simplistic without any sort of nuance to it. And then to make it worse, we see a conversation at the end of this book where, we see two conversations. We see one conversation where someone basically asks Snow about humanity, or Snow hasn't quite got it yet. He hasn't understood the theme of the book yet. And then we see one at the end where he does understand the theme of the book. And basically through this dialogue between two characters, the book spoon feeds you what it's trying to tell you. And I just was so not about it, because it just, to me, it felt like Collins was not comfortable in her portrayal of the theme, so she had to throw in this scene where she made it very clear to the reader. And let's get into the world building really quickly. To me, this book was full of retcon world building, or retroactive world building. This book might be cool if you are interested in seeing the Hunger Games before they were really the Hunger Games that we know. There's basically nothing similar about the Hunger Games in this book and the Hunger Games in the original trilogy, except for the tributes, 2 from each district, who are thrown to arena and they kill each other. The Hunger Games we see in Ballad are nothing like the Hunger Games in the trilogy. The trilogy Hunger Games are a lot more performative and more high-tech, honestly. This book didn't feel like the Hunger Games of the trilogy, and it's because of the difference in world building. And so if you want to see a low-tech version of the Hunger Games, then this is an interesting portrayal of it. But to me, the glamour of the Hunger Games was what made it such a disturbing and such an awesome book. And so without that, when you take away your best world building aspects, to me, it leaves you with something quite boring. I just was not a fan. I wasn't a fan of taking it back and seeing what the Hunger Games used to be, because I think it took away a lot of the stuff that made the Hunger Games great. So now that I've gone through my 5 categories for this book, I want to just talk about the big problem that I think is the reason why all of my criticisms exist in this section right before spoilers. There will be no spoilers in this section still. To me, all of these issues stem because Snow is such a one-note character. He's not a character in the original trilogy who had the promise of a story, and he didn't have all that much character other than what he had to be Katniss's villain. He was a great Katniss's villain, but I'm not sure that he's the greatest as a protagonist of his own story. And I feel like that is the reason we see the nothing happening plot-wise, the inconsistent characterization, the nonsensical plot at times, the retcon world building, the repetitive themes. I could go on, but those are the main things that I think that he affects. That's one of the reasons I think that this book didn't work, because even it being published was just a stretch. And then my other major problem was I don't think that the point of this book, what this book was trying to do, was explicit enough or at all. There was a lot that you were kind of meant to infer, like, oh, is this how Snow gets that trait of his that we know from the first trilogy? There's so many different threads that are not really explored to their fullest and are not concluded, and due to that, I'm left wondering what the point of this book even was. Because it didn't complete what it was supposed to complete, or what it seemed like it was trying to complete or lead to, it just feels pointless. And it's honestly so disappointing, because one of the things I loved about the Hunger Games is there's always more levels. Take the Mockingjay, for example, from the original trilogy. There's so much to that Mockingjay. It's like the pin that Katniss wears, and also the Mockingjay are like a symbol of the thing that the Capitol can't control. And then because it's associated with Katniss and what Katniss does, it's also this like the symbol of resistance, and it comes up like over and over again. And so there's just so many layers to so many things in the Hunger Games, and I was left with nothing in this book. It didn't feel anything like that. It felt like a lot of what this book tried to do didn't even complete it, much less build on itself. And so this book honestly feels like it didn't really offer me anything. I'm happy if it offered you something, but for me, it didn't offer anything new. It didn't really add to my experience of the Hunger Games. I didn't really need this book to exist, to be honest. I'm happy if you got something out of it, and if you disagree with me, that is, I totally respect that opinion. I'm glad that someone got something out of this. I just didn't. And this has been my spoiler-free review telling you why I didn't like this book. Thank you for watching this review. If you are leaving when the spoilers start, I will see you next time. Bye. And if you're here for the spoilers, hi, we have a lot to talk about. Okay, Tigress is Snow's cousin? Who was expecting that? Also, why? I thought Tigress's inclusion in Mockingjay was stupid in the first place. Tigress was just this unexplained, like, tiger woman who, like, helped Katniss, who no one had ever heard of. There was no precedent for her to be there. And she was, like, helping them kill Snow, I'm pretty sure. I don't know if she knew that's what she was doing, but she was helping them kill Snow, who we find out is her cousin? What? And I was expecting to see some sort of, like, fallout between them, or some sort of reason why Tigress would betray him this way, or, like, some reason for the coincidence of her hiding Katniss and supporting a rebellion against him to make sense, and that never came. And so, like, you can only assume that she didn't appreciate Snow's actions as president, or as he got into being an official, but she lived in the Capitol too, so it's kind of like, it's kind of just, I know it's not Tigress's story, but she's just kind of there, and she didn't need to be, because we didn't have any sort of completion to her arc. It was just like she was added, and we can infer stuff if we want, but this book's not going to help you. And let's go from there to other things that didn't pay off, because a lot of things didn't pay off. One of the things I think didn't pay off was how the Hunger Games start as this, like, not a spectator sport, and Snow suggests to get the viewers more involved. And even by the end of this book, although they do include sponsorships in the 10th Hunger Games, the Hunger Games they don't really look anything like they did in the first trilogy, and none of that really changes. We don't really see anything change. We don't even get a hint, really, that is going to change. I assume that when Snow becomes president, it's him who inputs a lot of those changes, but we don't get any confirmation of that. Not even in, like, an epilogue, or he doesn't even have most of the ideas that we associate with the Hunger Games in this book. And I think that that would have been an easy way to make that arc pay off a little bit, or just make it a bit more clear that that's where it was going. But as of right now, I have no idea whether Snow had anything to do with making the Hunger Games what they were, because it wasn't explored at all. Also, the songs were interesting, like the green grass one that Katniss sings to Rue as Rue dies, that one appears in this book, and then there's the hanging tree appears in this book. But they don't really pay off either, because, like, they're presumably songs that Lucy Gray wrote. At least that's what I got from the hanging tree. But, like, we don't get any resolution of Lucy Gray and where she ends up. And so it's hard to say, like, how they made their way into the first Hunger Games trilogy, and how they kind of, do they become part of the seam? Does Lucy Gray, like, teach them to her kids and stay in the seam? Like, what goes on? How do these songs, like, end up with Katniss years later? And it's left for you to make that up, I guess, because there's not really that many clues, which is another thing that annoyed me. There's so many, like, nods to Katniss in this, like, with the seam, and with, like, the thing they literally pick up, like, a a plan of Katniss. Like, and then the songs, it's just, I thought it was leading to like, oh, someone's descended from Katniss, which would have been stupid, but it's almost stupider to not give me any resolution to that and like plant all these like little hints, but to not tell me like whether Katniss is presumably she and Gale, honestly, because they're both Seam kids, are like related to the Covey, and because like Katniss has the singing father and she like sings into these songs, there's a link there. But because Lucy, we don't ever find out what happens to her, we're just kind of meant to like speculate, and it just wasn't done in a way that I found satisfying at all. Lucy Gray and Snow had the most uncomfortable relationship I think I've ever witnessed, because it was just hard to tell. Like, this is the thing with Snow, right? It's so hard to tell what he feels about people, because he's very possessive over Lucy Gray, but he also seems to love her, and so he's definitely a toxic person. Like, I got that much. But he also is so willing to like talk himself into hating her at times that it's kind of just, I don't ever feel what he feels about her. I never know what he actually feels about anyone. And it's not in this cool, mysterious way. It's in a way where it's like, no, it literally just isn't being written. And I feel that way about how he interacts with Sejanus, because Sejanus, or whatever his name is, he also has like such a weird arc with him. At first I was like, oh, Sejanus is like the little annoying person who thinks he's Snow's friend, and Snow just like doesn't think that, but he's nice to him, and that's what he was at first. And then they seem to have like a real friendship, but Snow also betrayed him so easily. But then he also was like crying over it, and I was like, what is Snow's character? How does he have any relationships with any of these people? Because he doesn't really seem to. Yeah, I literally saw Lucy Gray come onto the page. Their romance was like insta love. I was just like, why? They have no chemistry. Why would you ever fall in love with your mentor? There's no reason for Snow to do that. Like, there was no reason for her to like him the way she did. There was no reason for him to like her the way he did. And then the climax was just terrible. Like, somehow she figured out that he had turned into Sejanus or whatever. Like, how? Somehow she turned on him, and then like nothing really happened. He never finds out where she is. I hated it. I hated this book. I gave it 1 star. I didn't like this book. I can't think of a single thing I liked in this book except like maybe the songs, but also the payoff for the songs wasn't there, so never mind. And that is the end of this review. So thank you for watching. If you stayed to the end, if you got through this whole thing, thank you. This has been my spoiler-free and spoiler review of The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes, and I hope you have a fantastic day, and I will see you next time. Bye.